And I think we're live. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Can I just ask for a sort of a quick show of hands in the chat bar, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, just to make sure that you can hear us. I guess I will assume that you can see me and you can see Jess and you can see Henry on your screen. So that seems to be going brilliantly. So the technology is working, which is half the battle. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm really happy that you've been able to join us for this conversation about the Northern Powerhouse, and delighted that Henri Murison of Northern Powerhouse Partnership and Jessica Bowles of Bruntwood are able to join us to share their views on this. I'm lucky to have known Henri for some time and have collaborated from time to time, and have seen his passion for this subject. I'm just getting a little bit of background noise here, but the Northern Powerhouse Partnership have been a really powerful advocate for the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. And what we're really here to do today is to look at what the Northern Powerhouse Partnership and what indeed the Northern Powerhouse means in a post-COVID-19 lockdown. Where are we going with this when we enter into a recovery phase? I'm also really pleased to have Jessica Bowles to join us as Director of Strategy for Bruntwood. Bruntwood are a fantastic company that I'm lucky enough to have bumped into from time to time in my professional career, and from a sort of a very much a northwest roots are now working across the whole of the north, which is really great to see. A fantastic business. And for our part, Quatro, we are a national public relations company working with clients across the country on whether it's political engagement, community consultation, advocacy. We've worked in Liverpool, Newcastle, Leeds, Sheffield, and indeed Manchester. And you may know us from our weekly Northern Powerhouse Roundup newsletters, and indeed more recently our COVID-19 collection of news and stories. So to the subject, in my view, the Northern Powerhouse, devolution, levelling up have been primary markers of debate for the government, certainly over the last few years, and in my opinion, have really become much more pronounced over the last number of months, where we've seen promises made around funding and we've seen commitments by the government. We saw a budget which seems like an eon ago at the beginning of March. But what does that mean now? Where are we? The COVID-19 pandemic has transformed our lives, our personal lives, our businesses. And I think it's sensible and prudent to discuss what does that actually mean. Economic development is clearly going to be an important marker of the debate going forward. But what does that mean for levelling up? What does it mean for devolution? What does it mean for Northern Powerhouse? This webinar is effectively a panel discussion on our computer screens in our lounges, kitchens, and spare rooms. I'm very familiar with chairing discussions and panel debates and meals and speaking on the radio or speaking to newspapers. This is a bit new to me, so bear with me and we'll see how we do. The technology is also a bit new to us, so let's see how we get on with it. But I'm really pleased to have Jessica and Henri here to share their views. Now, you'll notice that we have got down the right-hand side a chat function, which many of you have been already sort of giving high fives and thumbs up to various people. In the bottom of the screen, you'll see that we've got a poll there. And that if you just press on that poll, it will lift up a question. And that's another way that you'll be able to just interact with some of the discussions that we're going to be having. We'll post a few questions there for you to kind of just give your sentiment on. It's a snapshot of opinion, nothing more. If you have questions, plug them into the right-hand side of the screen in the chat bar, and I'll do my best to pick them up. I've got a couple of questions up my sleeve to bowl in Jessica and Henri's direction, and we'll see how we get on. I'm really looking forward to hearing your views. You don't want to hear so much from me, but let's see how we get on over the course of the next 50 minutes. How I'm going to structure it is I'm going to ask Henri to set out for over maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes, just his proposition on the future of the Northern Powerhouse. I'll pass to Jessica. I'll see how the questions are doing. I've got a couple up my sleeve, as I say, but then we'll see where we get to in 50 minutes time, something like that. Enough from me. Over to you, Henri.
Brilliant. No, great to speak to you all. And I'm not in the south of France, like despite the lights. I genuinely am in Yorkshire. This isn't some con. I'm actually on the other side of the world. So I think the start of the 10 really is that clearly this has been a really challenging few weeks, particularly for some of the most vulnerable in our communities. I think you need to kind of start from that place to understand what it is that we need to do next. And I think my sort of starting point is that I think some of you may have seen the Yorkshire Post this morning. Grant Shapps has written a piece about the government's kind of remaining commitment to levelling up and what that will mean for the north of England. And I think there is an element that if you didn't think you needed to have an unprecedented increase in R&D spending and a significant investment in infrastructure, then being faced with potentially a very short-term increase in unemployment is a good thing to focus the mind. And I think that we have a view which is that you almost need to have a recovery for all, right? So the reality is that the recovery is going to be the most important thing that's going to happen, that we're going to need to make happen in this country, but we're not going to have enough money to then go back later and rebalance the economy again, if that makes sense. So either we're going to do the economic recovery right, or we'll miss the opportunity to also fix some of the underlying problems in the British economy. So I think where we've got to in our own internal thinking, and it's one point of view, and there are lots of really valid ones. I look forward to hearing from loads of them today, and I'm really glad particularly that Jessica's here, because I think that there's a kind of a really important dimension about what businesses themselves are doing to respond to the crisis and how that feeds into what we need to think about in terms of what we do next. And I kind of start from the premise that actually, if you have an economic opportunity, which is the scale of the North, so some work we had commissioned by Steer Economic Development showed that not just the transport, but all the different things together probably give you a prize of somewhere around £1 trillion by 2050. That if you have got also a significant deficit you're going to have to pay back at some point in the future, then you're going to need to have a different type of economy to the one you have today to be able to service the levels of debt that we're rightly going to have to in order to have protected the health of so many of us and our neighbours and friends in the last few weeks. So the kind of economic rebalancing proposition is that we're not doing this for the North's benefit. I think that's my starter for 10, that if we're going to rebalance the country's economy, it's to help play a part in a wider national effort. And that was always my understanding of why we were doing this in the first place, which was that after Brexit, in whatever form that takes, you're going to need to have an economy that's more successful and rounded than the one we've had previously. And this just focuses those thoughts, I think, even more clearly. And very practically, what we need to do is, I think, set up a Northern growth body. So I wrote something for Simon last week for the ever read and well edited, I hasten to add, weekly publication that Quatro put out across people's email boxes. And what we were alluding to really is the fact that the Prime Minister's already promised this, right? So this isn't some argument for some sort of special treatment or something that is kind of almost like opportunistically coming out of this crisis. The reality is we just need to accelerate the things that the government was already going to do anyway. And I think Simon Clarke, who also joined some Northern business leaders, including Jess's colleague Chris, as well as numerous other business leaders from organisations like Adelshaw Goddard's, people like Manchester Airport, the chief exec of TalkTalk, the chief executive of AO, who also runs a network of charities in terms of his on-site youth zones across the North and now in the rest of the country. And in that discussion, Simon Clarke was really clear that actually things like devolution, the devolution white paper, are not going to stop. And actually that they see them as being critical to dealing with the legacy of what we're going through. And absolutely, the first attention of government at the moment is on keeping people safe and supporting particularly the work that local government are doing to ensure that in social care we have as strong a response as we've had in the healthcare system. The economic response that government have made has been critical to enabling people to stay at home and to helping to support people, but it's obviously not a perfect response, and it can never be perfect because they're blunt instruments, forms of the financial support that have been offered to businesses and individuals. And what comes next, right, is the targeted interventions that will help fix the damage that has been caused by what's happened in the last few weeks. And I'm really clear that giving government more bandwidth by taking what I would consider to be decisions that should have been made outside Whitehall in the North and in other parts of the country, the same argument applies in the South West and the Midlands actually, and giving more responsibility to our mayors is the right way to respond to this crisis, because government is going to be distracted by this. And we saw through the Brexit negotiations that government also didn't really get round to an industrial strategy because they were too busy dealing with Brexit. And I think that my kind of take would be to all those who are kind of thinking about these issues, that if you think that government has done a good or a bad job, There are arguments about how much local government's been empowered to lead and drive the response, and I think those are worthy discussions to have. But I don't think anyone would disagree that the centre is the right vehicle to do the kind of detailed industrial strategy policy making that government couldn't do even during Brexit. And this, in terms of those negotiations, this is a much more significant set of commitments that government's made in terms of its capacity, and particularly the capacity of number 10, regardless of whether the Prime Minister's at work or not. That the idea that from Whitehall and that machine around number 10 and number 11, however capable the individuals may be, that they can do the detail of the economic policy making that needs to happen is for the birds. And that's the reason why Rishi Sunak was setting up an office for the Treasury in the north, right, in wherever it was going to be, because all of this is about creating the bandwidth you need to be able to make decisions in a more joined up way and working in partnership with people rather than telling them the answers to their own problems. And I think if you trust people in the midst of this crisis to play a constructive role in dealing with the underlying issues in our economy, but doing that in such a way that we maximise the investment we have to enable us to respond to this crisis, and in particular, ideas like, for instance, accelerating the rollout of full fibre in the north of England were a good idea anyway to rebalance the economy. They're now essential because we've got a large number of people who are going to have short-term requirements to be employed who have lost their jobs. Well, industries like that can absorb large numbers of people, tens of thousands of people, and quickly retrain them to do productive, high quality, well-paid work. Those are opportunities you can't turn down. And I think that the reality is we need to embrace those opportunities and empower the north of England and our mayors to work together to actually deliver those opportunities on the ground.
Thank you, Henry. Brilliant. There's a lot there. Thank you very much. Jessica, can you give us your starter for 10? How do you approach this question of will we meet again, the Northern Powerhouse, post-COVID-19? Oh, I'm not sure we can hear you, Jessica.
I toggled my microphone on. We've got a massive echo on the line, so can I just ask Simon and Henry to mute themselves? Right, okay, I can hear a bit better now. So my starter for 10. I've still actually got a really, really bad echo. Are people hearing an echo on the webinar? Right. So yeah, I have still got an echo that's quite distracting.
Likewise. I'm gonna okay. We seem to be having some audio pollution here. Henry, can you how is your oh, Jessica's back with some headphones. Let's see how this goes.
Right, let's see if this is better. It's still quite bad, echoey, but I'll have a go. So from a business perspective, we went into this
If you take out the headphones and give that a go for a moment, see how that goes. No.
Yeah.
I think, Jessica, you leave the headphones plugged in, but don't listen to it.
Another suggestion. Okay, is that better?
That's a lot better.
Yeah. Fine. So this crisis came up in a very it came on us really quickly, and I think that meant that we moved into crisis response mode, and that's a very, you know, we sort of know how to deal with those crises as both cities and businesses, I think, and we moved very fast over that period. What I was really delighted to see was how fast some of the more progressive cities and some businesses were starting to think about recovery, because I think from where we head next, we have to be thinking early stages about that. And it was very clear that this is going to be a very deep recession. We don't really know how long that's going to be and what shape that's going to be as we come out, but it's very clear that we're going to have to work collectively to do that, and to dig ourselves back out, and to create the economy that we need to that we want to have as we look ahead. And what's been very interesting, we're a company that has 3,000 businesses in our spaces, from everything from kind of professional services companies, large corporates, through to startups, tech companies and life sciences businesses, as well as retailers, both, again, high street retailers and independents. Is that there's been quite a, you know, there is quite an opportunity for some of those businesses to respond, that they've responded in very different ways, and will be able to, we think, contribute to the economy as we look ahead. What I found, what I think is interesting about Henri's piece and the comments that he had were that we need to pick up and build on what we were already doing. So we made the case and we made the argument. There's no less argument around investment in infrastructure. There may be some shifts around the margins, there may be different timescales to those things, but they do still, the cases have been made. We also see, you know, and from our business, that there are some of those economies and some of those sectors and specialisms that we've known are going to be the foundations and bedrock of our economy as we look ahead, that are going to be more important than ever. So life sciences, health innovation, health tech, that space, and growing that economy and the supply chains that sit around that is going to be a real opportunity for us across the north, but also a need and a requirement, and there will be, I think, quite a, you know, very significant focus on that. We can already see this at Alderley Park, which is one of the government's testing sites, where it's not just Medicine's Discovery Catapult that's created the Lighthouse Lab for testing at Alderley Park, but other businesses around the site who are part of that wider effort around developing both treatment and diagnostics for COVID, but also for other potential pandemics. And so, and that we're also getting a very great interest in other businesses wanting to grow and develop and come to the site. So I think we've got some sectors that are going to weather this in a very different way to others. I think the trick will be how we collectively support those businesses that we really need to have as part of our communities and societies that are going to struggle to find their way through in the short term. So retailers, leisure, you know, the things that arts and cultural organisations and community organisations that are part of the lifeblood of what make our places thrive and interesting, and places that we all want to live and be in. So there are some challenges about how we do that. Perhaps we can come on to talk about those a little bit more. Sorry, that was such a sort of rocky start into that, but hopefully we've got there.
That's brilliant, Jessica. Thank you, and sorry for the the technical issues at the beginning there. I want to pick up on something that both of you have just talked about, which is very much about the future, taking from the past, but projecting to the future. And I'm hearing the warning signs of audio invasion again. But see if I can continue. You talked, Jessica, about the importance of some of the businesses that you're working with in health innovation, health tech sectors, and indeed there'll be a whole range of sectors that the North has got real capability in, and will be, real stalwarts for the future growth of our economy and our places, providing all of the jobs and skills that we need in the future. And but I'm also kind of, I guess I'm thinking also about some of the points that we've talked about previously around the importance of devolution and state functions and the proper location of power. And I guess the question is, what are the fresh battles that we need to fight to make the case for the North? And I guess, what are the particular things that we need beyond the conversations about levelling up and infrastructure, but that we need from government to support on some of these future-facing industries? And I guess the other one as well, which has come up in the questions as well, has been around low carbon. And I guess in the background there, the importance of COP26, when it might actually happen now, and the wider net zero agenda. And if you've got any thoughts on what the Northern Powerhouse can do in terms of those aspirations. To have a go at it first. Oh, yeah, your microphone, Henry. Jessica, do you want to have a go? Henry, I think we're struggling with Henry's microphone. Okay. We're struggling with Jessica, can you hear me? I think we've lost sound. Has Henry or Jessica been muted, Holly? Hello?
I'm struggling to turn on my
Okay, well, we're obviously struggling here a little bit. Henry, are you able to hear us? Turn your microphone on. Jessica?
So I can't hear you at the same time as speak.
Okay. Okay. Well, okay. Sorry about this, guys. The technology platform is. Let me have a go. I think let me give you a sense of where I'm at on this. So I think that a lot of the conversations that we've had over recent years matter, and I think that the case that we've made, whether it's for Transport for the North, infrastructure funding, whether it's the case that's been made that Henry was articulating earlier on a Northern Growth Company, I think, and indeed, not just Northern Powerhouse partnership causes, but what we've seen from the North Health Sciences Alliance, we've seen a lot of really powerful advocacy for investment in industry, in the north and investment in skills. And I think our metro mayors have played a really important part in that, alongside businesses and alongside organisations such as Henri's, and Henri touches on. And I think that they are arguments that we're going to still need to play incredibly strongly as we move forward. We seem to have lost Henri. Hopefully he'll be able to join us in a few moments. But I think those are arguments that we're going to still need to play. But I think that we're going to be in quite a different political climate when we come out of this. We've seen, as Henri touched on, the role that Brexit played on dampening down and really narrowing the scope for political conversation. But what was impressive about Northern Powerhouse was how it continued to play into that conversation. But I think that we are going to have to reposition a lot of the arguments that we're going to be making in order to play into a slightly redefined political position and narrative. And I think the language that I was hearing from Jessica, the language I was hearing from Henri about how it's not about the North, it's about the UK. How it's not about the begging bowl of the North. It's actually about, this is good for the UK. And actually, we've got world-class businesses, world-class organizations who have got a really important role to play for the nation. And what this is about finding the right tools. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's more than money, to actually enable those businesses to really thrive and to unlock potential. I'm really struck by the higher education sector at the moment. I think there was a really interesting piece in one of the papers, I forget which, over the last couple of days, which was talking about the impact that COVID-19 will have on the higher education sector. Hello again, Henri. And I'm just giving a little ramble. There we go. Just giving a little ramble.
Might be able to hear you, Simon. So.
Oh, good. Well, I hope it's good. And I think the higher education sector, we've made a real virtue of how important they play, how important the universities play in our towns and our cities across the north of England. And I think they are going to come under stress over the coming months as we see particularly a drop in the number of international students. And I think that therefore opens up a conversation about a wider set of policy initiatives that may be needed that are relevant to the north of England, but also relevant much beyond that as well. So I'm conscious I'm probably rambling because I didn't prepare for this, and there's a whole lot here to chew into. But I'm just going to go back to see, Henri, your microphone seems to be working, and I just wondered
if again. Sorry about that. I made the mistake of putting in headphones so I could better hear Jess, and I think I broke my own sound, so that's my fault. So I think, to kind of partly answer your challenge and Jess's kind of remarks as well, I think that there's a big list of stuff we should do for ourselves. And I think that the challenge is that I don't think that waiting for government to decide that, for instance, the capabilities we build at Alderley around COVID-19 are something that can be built on to then create a centre of excellence that might be used more widely for facing similar challenges in the future. I think we should identify if that's a good idea and choose to do it ourselves. The same way, kind of looking at the chat, we talked a lot in the call so far about energy. Clearly, that's going to be one of the things that a Northern growth body needs to focus on. And I think the N8 have rightly been focusing on how working together our institutions could play a bigger role in the university sector in supporting us to make that industrial success for the North an opportunity, not just for us, but for the whole country. So I think whether it's small modular reactors or carbon capture and storage, I actually don't think we've got a shortage, Simon, of good ideas and projects and collaborations that already exist. I think part of the problem is we just need to stop waiting for Whitehall to give us permission and be empowered to do it now rather than wait any longer. So I think that we spent time as a partnership, and I think our partners across key organisations like the ones you mentioned, including the NHSA and others, have spent a lot of time and effort thinking about the future. I think our mayors have really kindly supported many of those initiatives, but I think the kind of underlying challenges around education and skills and the enablers of productivity, I think, are as important as the kind of transport debate. And I think the one thing that will happen after COVID-19 is that clearly we're going to talk a lot more about modal shift in transport and less about just increasing demand, because the reality is that the fact that less people are going to be travelling for a little while after this, and will probably need to limit their travel for a while, gives us a bit of breathing space to convince them to travel in different ways when they start moving around again. And I think that certainly one of the areas we were talking to Grant Shapps about yesterday with business leaders is how we do some of those things in practice now. So I think we need to repoint the transport discussion to predominantly be about how we address the climate change debate, rather than just thinking about connecting cities better, because I think that is a narrow version of that debate. And I think, again, it's that point about you can't invest twice. We're going to have to invest to connect better the north and to decarbonise at the same time. We're not going to get a chunk of money to better link cities and then another chunk of money to better address the climate change debate. And so whether that's a hydrogen train or whatever it is, for certain communities, these are interventions that we can't wait around for. We're going to need to do them quite quickly. But what we can't be doing is thinking, oh, we can buy some new diesel trains next week and then we can buy some new hydrogen ones the week after. Because I think that doesn't reflect the reality that this is a historical opportunity to sort out a number of underlying problems in the economy. And while we're doing those things, we can address the short-term economic distress that communities are going to feel. And those two things are not in conflict. Fundamentally, building small modular reactors, building more fibre, researching and better understanding how we could lead the energy transition, these are all things that generate jobs now. And so the point is, it's not about doing those or the recovery and thinking about supporting existing businesses, because in reality it's the same job. And the way that, for instance, Sellafield are supporting their supply chain over the last few months is an example that businesses realise that you can let a short-term economic event completely destroy the way you do business, and then when you go back to those people in a few weeks, they're not going to be there anymore. You have to be in for the long haul. And the point about a long-term economic project is it's the right response to a short-term catastrophe, because a knee-jerk response that doesn't address the fundamental economic challenges we have won't actually allow us to deal with the problems we really face, and then we won't have the money left to come back and fix those later. So I hope we can be focused in the way we do the economic recovery so that we don't miss the chance to do it right.
Thank you, Henry. It looks like we've lost Jessica, unfortunately, for a moment, but we're going to see if we can find a way of reconnecting with her offline. I'm just going to look at some of the questions that we've been having, and we've also got a second poll question that's just come up, which is about the figures that came out from the Office of Budgetary Responsibility a couple of days ago. So I'll leave those to you. One of the points that I wanted to touch on was just to sort of step out of the north a little bit to look at the political climate in which we're operating. And one of the fresh departures, Henry, for the Northern Powerhouse ambition is we have a resurgent Labour Party in opposition, and whether or not you have any views on what that might mean for the political prioritisation of the Northern Powerhouse project.
I think it's important in the sense that the people involved are now serious economic thinkers who've got the capacity and capability. So the Rachel Reeveses and the Bridget Phillipsons of this world, and Lucy in Ed Miliband's team at Bayes, are people who fundamentally understand the importance of rebalancing the British economy. And so it's all very well to have an opposition that talks about the North. It's having an opposition capable of stringing together an argument and a coherent economic understanding of how you might actually make things better here. Because I think what we don't want, and I don't want it from anyone, is people feeling sorry for us. That's not the problem. Do you mean people have felt sorry for the North for a long time? I'm pretty sure that during deindustrialisation, the first time round, people felt sorry for the North, or at least some people did. Didn't mean necessarily they did anything about it, or they had a coherent answer to how it could be fixed. You have a shadow Treasury team with, I think, one of the brightest people in Bridget, certainly that represents any part of the north of England, and in Sunderland, kind of grappling with the challenges that she has as a constituency MP, understands the reality of deindustrialisation as well as anyone. And those other individuals I mentioned are a pretty capable group of people that I would be very surprised if together they can't turn the Labour Party into a machine that can have something coherent to say about the economy, working in support of the Shadow Chancellor and the leader. And I think that for the government, I think our chair, George Osborne, said it on Twitter, do you mean after this is over, the reality is it's not a bunch of Marxists anymore who are facing up on the other side, and the government's going to need to get a little bit more competent if they're going to be able to win the argument. Now, obviously, I'm not an ex-Tory Chancellor, so I wouldn't quite put it in those words. But I think George is right. I think that for the first time in a while, the government won't have it all its own way. And I think that there are people on the government side who are really clear that they want to deliver on this agenda, and I'm sure that they'll not make it easy for the Labour Party to be able to evidence that they've not done enough. But I think there will be somebody on the opposition benches capable of saying, when they look at the government's plans for a Northern Growth Body, whether they think it goes far enough. And I think the argument that the people will be having will be, how far can you go and how quickly? But I think that what we also have is a historical consensus amongst all those in Westminster that they don't think they have a virtue or a complete understanding of how to solve these problems, and actually that decentralising power and resources is the right approach. And in the context of a commitment to decentralisation that's cross-party, a commitment to investing more in R&D and transport infrastructure, for instance, that's a pretty good basis to start the debate, I think, in the context of what happens after the current crisis.
And Jessica, welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us, for persisting. Can you hear us okay? Just struggling to hear you. Are you on?
I'm trying to remove mute.
Ah, there we go.
Okay. How's that?
That's great. Jessica, one of the questions that's just come up on the question feed, which I'd appreciate your view on, is about the role of entrepreneurship. We've talked a lot about trains. We talk about a lot about skills. We talk about, industries of the future, where the growth is going to come from. What are you seeing and feeling about the role of entrepreneurs in a future Northern ascendancy?
Yeah. One of the points that I was starting to talk about earlier was about those businesses that have been able to adapt quickly and be able to change their business models right now, be able to respond to what's going on in the external environment. And I think entrepreneurship is such an important part of that, and those skills that entrepreneurs have in being able to spot a market and kind of move fast are things that we've seen the value of over this very short period, but are going to be absolutely critical as we look to rebuild the economy. So really being able to not just replicate old business models, but understand how we can adapt and move those. And I suppose the question really comes, how do we ensure that there's support for entrepreneurs? Because at the same time, you can see the risks associated with self-employment and running your own business through this period have been very great. And I'm not sure how people are going to respond. Having worked in the public sector before, it hasn't felt like a very, good environment to work in for quite some period of time. But it seems like quite a safe haven right now if you're in the wider economy. So support for entrepreneurship, which enables people to take risks and encourages that within a supportive environment. And if I think about kind of the sort of innovation ecosystem you can create and the way that can be supported through a whole range of things, including how we help people access finance, but also how you create really strong mentorship for businesses and entrepreneurs who are starting out, people who've been there and done it already. And there is clearly there's a lot of that has happened across the north, and there's a lot of resource and people and human capital we can draw on to support people as they're building businesses and creating. So I think it's a really critical part of the economy and environment that we're going to have to create, and we've seen the value of it, and we need to help back off the risk. And that's not about meaning you can't fail, but it is about in providing enough of the right sort of support.
And yes, we seem to have lost Henri, unfortunately. It's kind of like smoke and mirrors here, really. It's change of or sliding doors or something like that. One of the bits that's come up in the Henri's back. We just can't see him apparently. One of the things that's come up in the chat box, which people are picking up on, is we've talked a little bit about strategies that can be forged and honed and delivered here in the north of England by ourselves, and an element of, what do we need to, what do we actually need to seek from central government in order to enable it? I wonder if you've got any views on that, Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had a view that the Northern Powerhouse should be our thing rather than central government develop something and give it to us. And perhaps I have a slightly, I come at that perspective having worked in central government for 15 years or so and seen how it doesn't do this stuff very well from central government, and having also worked in local government and then here in the business in the north. And I think that we have a real opportunity to own the agenda and do and understand what it is that we need at a level of granularity and reality that you cannot get from central government. Now, what we absolutely need is a relationship with central government that allows us to have a mature debate of equals, and to be able to ensure that we have long-term investment that goes beyond political cycles, that supports the North to put in place the things that it needs to do. So, I'm a great believer in devolution because I think you make better, more joined up decisions the closer you are to an issue. And that takes me to a kind of slightly to another point, which is that the Northern Powerhouse needs to do the things it's good at and capable of doing, but also empower and support what places are trying to achieve individually. So that it's a kind of pushing power away rather than centralising it, but using the Northern Powerhouse and using the North's collective voice to have that mature relationship of equals with central government. Now, I might be being, we're some way from having that, but I do think that that's where we should be aiming to get to.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Jessica. Henri, you're back with us. I'm just going to point out to everybody that at the bottom of the screen is a button called polls, and we've been running a few questions there. We've done 3 questions where we've asked for people's opinions, and the first one was the theme of this webinar, which is around about the future and the political prioritization of the Northern Powerhouse. The second one was really picking up on the OBR figures and whether or not the North will be worst affected. And I guess it's just, as we draw to the last 10 minutes or so of conversation, just any kind of sentiment, snapshot of view on whether or not the Northern Powerhouse, if people are optimistic about it. And so far, I think people are overwhelmingly optimistic, although we've still got a fairly small sample size, but I'm sure that will increase. But I want to pick up on one of the points that was made here, which I noticed Henri and Andrew in our audience were just chewing over, which was just about, we've talked about the sort of, the political prioritization and some of the themes of the Northern Powerhouse that we're revisiting at this time. But do you think that the impact of COVID-19 will have quite a beyond the sort of the obvious economic impact that it's going to have across all parts of society and demographics. Whether or not actually COVID-19 will bring in a dampening effect on globalization, as I've seen some commentators in the FT and the Economist talking about recently, a more cluster reshoring of manufacturing and less interest in sort of global activity and much more local. Any views on those points from Jessica first and then Henri?
So we have construction activity going on across our business. Let's just take it from that perspective. And while we've been able to safely, some of those sites are still operational, where they can do work in ways that are safe and socially distanced. But where we're struggling is around materials and supply, and that's really brought to the fore, I think, for a lot of businesses where their supply chains sit. So labour isn't the issue right now, but materials are. And I think that this whole crisis has raised that question of how long are our supply chains? How difficult is it to work in an environment where there is major global disruption? And this won't be the last bit of major global disruption. You know, if you think about, and I know you were having the conversation earlier around sustainability and low carbon, but you know, these kind of shocks and disrupted global trading routes, I think, are set to continue. So, which would suggest shortening our supply chains very dramatically. And you can see that we'll be responding to this pandemic by being able to onshore the things that we've lost, that that we've struggled with this time round. But how do we predict what those are going to be for the future and de-risk some of those issues? And I'm not sure. I think there'll be a balance of things where actually it makes no sense for us to make them, but we ought to be stockpiling things, and then there'll be areas where there's higher value to be had by actually just shortening the supply chain and having more manufacturing and more supply being generated here within the UK and within the North.
Views on the dampening of globalization and one of the points that Graham has put in the chat box about visibility or viability, of Northern Powerhouse airports.
Yes, I think my I suppose maybe I have a controversial view, which is I agree with everything Jessica said about the manufacturing economy, and actually globalization, though, is broader than just kind of flows of trade from China to the UK. Does that make sense in terms of goods? And that's the point about what we mean by globalization. And I think it comes down to really an intellectual argument about whether you think the solution to this is to put up the drawbridge or whether you need to work with others. And I think the scientific community is still working together. But you look at kind of the Trump response, the travel ban that didn't work. And so the thing is that in pure terms, protectionism, whether it's trade protectionism or kind of almost kind of protectionism of your own people in terms of sort of saying that this is all the fault of the outsider, and the kind of very racist stuff in America, right, about China, which just doesn't reflect the reality of how this started. It's a health emergency, not a geopolitical issue in my kind of gut. That's what it has to be primarily. I just don't think that's the response that most people will want in the end. And I think it's the point about the shared experience, right? So you want to understand, people in this country often like the idea they can buy something made somewhere else that's cheaper than buying something that's made here, but they don't necessarily see the person who makes that thing for them as being part of their world. Does that make sense? The externalities of their experience do not cause them any direct impact. The point is, as kind of Blair has argued in response to this, if this outbreak goes on in Africa for another 2 years before we get our vaccine sorted globally, then we'll keep getting waves more of it. Whereas if we can get African health systems and societies to be resilient to this pandemic, then the impact on us being reinfected from people who will always get around a travel ban, right? There are just too many diaspora around the world that you can't stop people moving around. It just makes so much more sense to think about this as a global problem and have a global solution. And I think what this highlights, this whole crisis, is if we had a more effective global order, if we'd not been in a period of poor governance and leadership in the United States around global issues, then we might have responded better to this. And I think I'm all for global economics, but I'm also for global political debate and structures. And the reality is, I think we have incredibly successfully globalized our science community. We've significantly globalized our manufacturing activity. And the point about the UK is we should be exporting a lot more high value products, right, rather than just commit with the IP and then not commercializing it properly. That's the opportunity for the UK, but actually that will require more collaboration. You look at the way that graphene's been developed in Manchester in partnership with countries around the world, and Masdar, for instance, is a really good example of that. There isn't a way of doing these really important manufacturing or kind of technological opportunities in isolation. The factories probably should a lot more of them be in the UK, but that isn't because of this specifically. That's because having end-to-end production and research is a good way of growing successful businesses. And so I think the challenge is if the second half of the crisis, the response isn't global, then I think that's a massive missed opportunity. And I think that the North collectively has its role in that actually our links to China and other parts of the world are probably stronger than the rest of the UK's. And we need to leverage those on an economic level to demonstrate the value of partnership rather than the value of protectionism and putting up the drawbridge.
Brilliant. Thank you, Henry. We're kind of quickly running out of time, but I'm going to pass for conch in Jessica's direction to see if she's got any parting words. And I'll just say one last thing. This chat, whilst we've had audio issues, and I really appreciate everyone's persistence and durability of getting through this, and we've had some brilliant conversation down the chat bar there, lots of great points, and I'm sorry if we've not got to all of you. I particularly liked yours, Louise, about industrial strategy, which I don't think we've given enough due diligence to, but I think that this has probably reminded me that we need to do more of this kind of stuff. So you'll hear from me in the future, I'm sure. But Jessica, before I give a couple of moments of summary, any kind of final thoughts from you?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I think the technical issues were at my end, and while we'd had a play with it beforehand, it was very challenging when we got online. So apologies for that, and my slight distraction with it. I thought I'd got all this stuff licked after working at home for 5 weeks. I mean, I think the discussion down the right-hand side has been fascinating, actually, and it raises so many interesting questions and dimensions, both to the crisis period and the recovery and the opportunities that come from it. I think getting a kind of a clear view about how the world might change is going to be incredibly challenging to do, but which kind of leads me back to your point around industrial strategy and how we need to go back to really understanding, to remembering all of the work that we've done around our strengths and specialisms and the opportunities we've got, because many of those are the same and will be dialed up in this period, or are things that we should be continuing to focus on, rather than us scrapping everything that we know and starting again in response to what is a global and long-term crisis. So I feel relatively optimistic that we have some of the answers to hand. I think, and I've been having the conversation both inside the business and with people within the Greater Manchester LEP and combined authority structures about how we need to see this recession that's coming and the recovery we need to have, but making it really relevant to now and to the tools that we have at our disposal, and not just seeing this as like every other recession has been, because they're all different in their nature and we have a different starting point within the cities and places that are across the north, and we need to use that knowledge combined with our knowledge of how to find our way out of recession and rebuild the economy. And I'm very keen that we should be having that as a very open discussion, and one that we all have a part to play in, I suppose. But I just want to thank people for their questions and ideas, because I think you're right, Simon, that doing more of this is really valuable, and I'd love to have heard more from all of the people who are out there on the call.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a commitment. We will do something like this again in the future, and I think we can certainly draw on some of the people who have kindly offered some comments and some considerations to do that. We've touched on a lot here. We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of territory, geographically, but also virtually, and also spiritually, in terms of the subject areas that we've been touching on. Whether it's been Henri's suggestion around where we start from is looking at, you know, how this impacts upon the most vulnerable, through to a recovery for all, through to globalization, through to looking at different sectors, through to looking at strategies for how we engage with what we need to on Whitehall in order to gain the powers and the funding that we may need to unleash a capability, but also what we can do for ourselves. And I think one of the themes that's come through both of your comments, and indeed I see it in the chat box, I think is the need that we need to own this agenda ourselves. This is not a servile position. This is not about a poor boy in the north role. This is actually about a very compelling economic and cultural strategy. I think culture is probably another one of those issues, which I know, Jessica, you picked up on, but it's something I think is really important for the North. It's part of our roots, part of our DNA, which I think is often overlooked. But I think it's a critical part of how we think about ourselves and think about our future. I'm going to thank everybody. I've ran over a minute or so longer than I intended to, but we also started a little bit later. Henri, thank you ever so much for all your help. Thank you, Jessica. Brilliant. And thank you. I'm panicking on the inside, karate man on the outside. And thank you everybody for participating in the polls and in the questions. And you'll hear from us a little bit later as we try and sort of pen this into one of our Northern Powerhouse roundup forwards. And thank you. So we'll see you all again. Thank you ever so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.